From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa Spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
What if I told you that the next world war won't be about oil or borders or ideology, but about water? Not because it's running out, but because it's being stolen, silently, systematically, and legally. In a dusty village in West Africa, pipes run beneath the earth, quietly sucking up millions of liters of fresh water every single day. The locals don't drink from it. They don't even know it's gone. Because that water, it's not flowing to their farms or kitchens. It's flowing across the border into lithium mines guarded by foreign mercenaries. And the deal that made it possible? Signed behind closed doors for $600 million without a single citizen's consent. So when the president of this nation found out, he didn't schedule a press conference. He declared war, not with guns, but with blueprints, bulldozers, and a 4-word message. Water is not negotiable. It began with a file, thick with satellite images, drone captures, intercepted emails. One sentence at the top printed in bold, "Your water is no longer yours." That dossier revealed the horrifying truth. An underground aquifer shared between two nations had been quietly privatized. 4 million cubic meters rerouted monthly. No media coverage, to no national debate, just a quiet theft in the name of development. And if you're thinking this sounds like fiction, well, so did the people who lost their crops, their wells, and their sovereignty. In America, we argue about water rights between states, between ranchers and cities. But imagine if Canada started siphoning water from Michigan through a secret pipeline protected by private troops. Would you call that trade? Or an act of war? If this scenario makes you pause, share your thoughts below. Because this isn't just a foreign story, it's a warning. The president didn't ask for permission. He walked into the war room, looked at the map, not of borders, but of pipelines, and said, "If we lose our water, we lose everything." That wasn't a metaphor. That was day one of a new doctrine, water as survival. And within 24 hours, he did something no African leader had done before. He signed the death certificate of every foreign-led water operation on his land. He didn't wait for parliament. He didn't hold a press briefing. He just walked into a closed meeting, slapped a single piece of paper on the table and said, "We start today." That paper? A $300 million decree, greenlit from a national reconstruction fund that barely anyone knew existed. No loans, no donors, no permission slips from the IMF. This wasn't a reaction. It was a blueprint. 5 new reservoirs, 200 deep-water wells, full independence from foreign-controlled water within 18 months. Some people in the room thought he was bluffing. By sunset, military trucks and drilling rigs were already moving. Now here's where it gets wild. This fund, the one backing the entire operation, was built in silence over years, right after the country ditched its IMF dependency. They'd been planning for this moment before anyone knew it was coming. And you know what? It actually worked. Within just 72 hours, teams were on the ground. Combat engineers, volunteer militias, even grandmothers with water maps and decades of knowledge were showing up to dig. If you think grassroots movements can't work at national scale, maybe you've been watching the wrong kind of news. Because in this country, people didn't wait for the government to fix things. They became the government. So let me ask you this. If Texas faced a total water shutdown and the federal government was silent, would Texans roll over, or rally up and drill? If you think they'd fight for it, maybe you already understand what's happening here. Drop your thoughts below. This isn't just about politics, it's about survival. Reservoirs were built where colonial pipelines used to run. Old contracts were canceled overnight. Foreign-led drilling permits? Revoked. And the country passed its boldest law yet, the Water Sovereignty Act. Any water transaction crossing borders, extraction, transfer, sale, now had to be declared, logged, and reviewed by a national commission. Violators faced revocation, blacklisting, and fines 5 times the value of the deal. It was bold. It was messy. But you know what it wasn't? Passive. And here's where the twist comes in. International firms didn't like it. They cried foul. They said it broke trade agreements. They warned of sanctions. The president didn't blink. He reached for a pen and said, "Then let them come." The Water Sovereignty Act wasn't just a law. It was a message. We're done asking nicely. From that day forward, every drop of water crossing the border had to be reported. Not just acknowledged, documented, reviewed, and approved by a sovereign commission. No paperwork, no deal. Violation meant blacklisting, revocation of all contracts, and a penalty 5 times the value of the hidden transaction. You try smuggling $20 million worth of groundwater and end up owing $100. This wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. Let's be clear, this isn't just one angry president swinging fists at big corporations. This was a government laying the legal foundation for something bigger, control over its own lifeline. And here's where things got interesting. 3 major foreign companies immediately started pulling out of the region. One Australian conglomerate issued a vague press release about regional instability. Another, based in France, closed its satellite office in the capital. A third tried to renegotiate and got denied. We're talking about companies that had been operating there for over a decade, gone within a month. That tells you something. When law gets teeth, even the big players back off. Meanwhile, local firms weren't jumping in either. Many of them hesitated. The penalties were steep. One misstep could mean losing licenses, losing face, and facing legal charges. But on the streets, people cheered. Not because they fully understood the policy, but because for once, it felt like someone upstairs was actually doing something that wasn't selling them out. Now here's a fact worth noting. This law passed without foreign legal advisors. No IMF consultants, no Western think tanks. The legal team that drafted it was 100% local, led by a group of public interest lawyers who used to work for NGOs, until they realized policy meant nothing without power. And if you're sitting in the US thinking, okay, but this could never happen here. Well, did you know that in 2023, 6 US states faced legal battles over private groundwater extraction? Including cases where Nestlé was bottling public water for pennies and selling it for profit. Now ask yourself, what would happen if a governor in Michigan passed a law like this? Would it be praised as bold or punished as unconstitutional? If that made you stop and think, tell me in the comments. Because these aren't just African questions, they're global ones. By the time the ink dried on the Water Sovereignty Act, it was already too late to stop the next move. The president wasn't just drafting laws, he was preparing for a confrontation. 3 days after the Water Sovereignty Act passed, satellite images picked up something strange near the northern border. Mercenary activity had increased. Heavier equipment, more surveillance drones, fortified checkpoints around key pumping stations. No national flags, no press, no official statements. Just 800 armed men protecting pipelines that didn't belong to them. Let's break that down. These weren't soldiers. They were private contractors, flown in quietly from various countries, paid to defend a $600 million water deal. Not gold, not oil, water. That number isn't an estimate. It came straight from leaked financial documents obtained by local intelligence, cross-referenced with movement patterns from drone footage. By this point, the president had already formed a task force. Not just military. It included hydro engineers, cyber specialists, satellite analysts, because the goal wasn't to destroy, it was to reclaim. Now, this wasn't a dramatic press moment. There were no speeches, no flags, no photo ops, but everyone knew something was coming. And here's where things got real. A convoy headed straight for one of the contested extraction sites. At the front, the president himself. No security detail, no suit, just boots, body armor, and a sealed case containing a manual override key. Behind him, not tanks, farmers, school teachers, volunteer medics. Over 1,000 civilians showed up, not with weapons, but with empty jerry cans and painted signs that said one thing: return our water. If you're watching this from the US, try to imagine the president walking to the gates of a fracked water site in Texas, flanked not by Secret Service, but by citizens holding buckets. Would the companies back down or call in reinforcements? Drop your honest take in the comments. Because this kind of resistance, it doesn't show up in polls, but it shows up in history. Back to the border. No one fired, no one moved. There was just a standstill between two forces, one paid to defend a contract, the other standing for something they literally cannot live without. And this wasn't spontaneous. The villagers didn't just show up. They coordinated through local radio, word-of-mouth text groups. Entire communities had been preparing for this, quietly, patiently, purposefully. One of the engineers with the president whispered, "Sir, we're in range. We can breach the valve manually." The response? "Then let's get close." The engineer turned the valve. It didn't budge. Locked. Biometric protocol tied to a remote server based outside the country. Translation? Even the hardware was rigged to obey foreign command centers. "Do it manually," the president said. That meant disabling the system on site, bypassing foreign encryption and applying physical pressure to break the seal. They knew it might trigger security, but they also knew every hour of hesitation meant thousands more leaders drained from under their feet. So they moved, with basic tools and satellite jammers in their backpacks. Here's what happened next. Local media stations went dark. Phone signals were jammed within a 2-kilometer radius. But someone, maybe a student, maybe a farmer, set up a makeshift live stream through a satellite uplink. And within 20 minutes, over 800,000 people were watching. By the time the crew breached the override panel, pressure sensors lit up. That's not speculation. That's confirmed from the post-incident diagnostic logs leaked weeks later. Pressure had built up for months. The moment the final latch was undone, a deep groan echoed under the ground. Then, water. Cold, clean, pressurized water surged through the line. Not all at once, not cinematic, but steady. That one stream reached 4 neighboring provinces within 48 hours. Farms rehydrated, pumps restarted. And for the first time in 18 months, people filled buckets without paying bribes or begging contractors. Now here's the part no one expected. Emergency reservoir systems installed just weeks earlier started activating. These were pre-built, solar-powered, gravity-fed. Local engineers had connected them to backup lines, waiting for this exact moment. The country's Ministry of Agriculture released stats just 11 days later. 7% increase in irrigation coverage. Malaria rates dropped by 18% due to stagnant water elimination. School attendance rose 9% in affected zones. Diarrheal infections dropped by 38%, according to health ministry records verified by UNICEF. These aren't projections. These are hard numbers, collected from actual field hospitals, schools, and water committees. Meanwhile, the global response? Muted. No major Western outlet ran the story on their front page. No breaking banner on CNN or BBC. But the footage still spread, because people shared it anyway. If you're American, ask yourself, what happens when infrastructure wins over violence? Would your media even cover it? Would it go viral without a villain or a body count? Let me know in the comments. Because if a peaceful water reclamation with 0 casualties doesn't count as news, what does? 72 hours after the valve turned, 4 heads of state gathered under a white canopy. No red carpets, no camera crews. Just one table, one document, and a single mission. Stop this from ever happening again. The document? The Sahel Water Treaty. 70 pages, co-authored by Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Guinea, and Niger. Signed, not promised. Its goal? Protect transboundary aquifers from unauthorized extraction, by law, by tech, and by force if necessary. Here's what it included. A $2.4 billion regional water defense fund, a real-time cross-border extraction monitoring system, mandatory disclosure of all foreign contracts, a legal framework to ban violators for life, not just fine them. And here's the game changer. Article 4 requires any foreign entity operating in the region to publicly disclose full extraction data, volumes, timeframes, GPS coordinates. Failure to comply? Immediate expulsion, no negotiation. That's not speculation. Within 3 weeks, 3 major foreign water firms withdrew. Aquaterra Limited, Australia, closed all local operations, Citing geopolitical concerns, Hydro South, France, pulled its engineering teams. A US-based company, name undisclosed, was denied treaty compliance and quietly exited without statement. That's how you know the treaty had teeth. And here's what's wild. All of this happened without a single dollar of aid from the IMF, World Bank, or EU. This wasn't development, this was independence. Now let me pause here and ask, what if this treaty wasn't about Africa? What if California, Arizona, and Nevada formed a coalition and banned private extraction across state borders? What if Nestlé or Coca-Cola had to hand over full water usage logs, publicly, or be banned? Would Washington allow that? Would Wall Street? If you think this kind of regional ownership should be possible anywhere, type "control your water" in the comments. Because treaties don't make headlines, but they do make history. Once the treaty was signed, it didn't end with applause. It started with action. Over 300 new water access points were built in just 6 months. That includes solar-powered wells, gravity-fed pumps, and micro-reservoirs near drought-prone zones. This isn't speculation. This came directly from the Ministry of Infrastructure, with oversight from regional water councils. Let's talk numbers. Agricultural output rose 20% nationwide. Rice yield in the Cove Valley doubled. Tomato cooperatives in the southeast broke record exports. For the first time in 20 years, grain was stored in surplus, not for emergency relief. Meanwhile, displaced families returned to villages. School enrollment in water-secured zones jumped. A new water employment scheme hired over 8,000 young workers. Water was no longer just flowing, it was employing. Now here's the kind of impact no one tracks, but everyone feels. Market water prices dropped from 400 CFA per liter to just 85. Children no longer walked miles for a single bucket. Grandmothers reopened home gardens that had cracked under years of drought. The economy didn't boom, it stabilized. And for most people, that was enough. But let's be honest, nothing is ever that simple. Critics question the long-term viability. What if the fund dries up? What if a new leader cancels everything? What if powerful nations retaliate by pulling trade deals? Valid questions. But here's the thing. At least they're asking them now instead of asking where their water went. So let's bring it home. If your community, wherever you live, isn't in control of its water, then someone else is. It might be a company, it might be another country, but it's probably not you. And if that doesn't bother you, you're not paying attention. Here's your straight-up call to action. Do you know who controls your water? Not just the source, but the contracts, the pipes, the terms. If the answer is no, you better find out. Because by the time it hits your faucet, it might already be too late. So comment your thoughts. Tag someone who needs to hear this. Like it if you believe sovereignty starts underground. And subscribe, because they buried our water stories for decades. Now it's time we dig them up.